Where does the power of a monarch, of a king or queen, really come from? Let's look at the British Isles. There have been kings and queens there for a long time, right? And you're all familiar, of course, with how the English language emerged in the British Isles centuries ago. But the history, the political history of the Isles, that's a bit more complicated than most people have the time or energy to learn. To begin with, there aren't just two big islands there, Ireland and Great Britain. There are over 6,000 islands in the British Isles, and a long, intricate and bloody history of warring between the disparate peoples of those isles. To say that nations like England and Ireland have been at odds with one another, or Scotland and England, well, that's putting it mildly. Today, the name United Kingdom might give you an unrealistic idea that everyone within the borders of that kingdom are happy to be there. Not exactly. Many people in Scotland would gladly change that name and pull out of the United Kingdom, just as Ireland did back in 1916. Of course, it took 5 more years for England to accept Irish independence, but still, they did it. So many Scots ask, why not us? With that in mind, consider this. The first real steps towards politically uniting the English and Scottish kingdoms were taken not by an English king, but by a Scottish one. His name was James Stuart, son of Mary, Queen of Scots, who was beheaded by none other than Queen Elizabeth herself. But when Elizabeth died in 1603 without an heir, the next in line to the English throne was Mary's son, James, who had already been crowned James VI of Scotland. He now became James I of England as well. Now, as you can imagine, there was consternation on both sides of the border over this Scottish king sitting on the throne of England, which may have had something to do with why King James published an essay of sorts in 1598 explaining, more than that, justifying his right to rule both nations on the basis of the Bible. In fact, his argument was the clearest royal defense of the concept of the divine right of kings, the idea that the king is chosen by God himself. In his treatise, James argues that monarchy is the true pattern of divinity. No other form of government comes closest to mimicking the authority of God himself. The king is like God, father to his people. And by repeated reference to the Bible, particularly to King David, James sets out the responsibilities and nearly limitless authority of the king. He quotes David as saying, for example, that the office of king is to minister justice and judgment to the people, and to advance the good and punish the evil. It is for the king to establish laws that bring peace and prosperity to his people, just as God created the legal foundation of the people in ancient times. And just like God, James argued that the king holds the power of life and death over his people. And even if the king fails in his responsibilities to the people, we must still obey him because he is the one chosen by God, not us. He has God's stamp of approval on him, King and God. By now you should recognize that name, King James. Yes, this is the king who commissioned a new translation of the Bible, still very commonly used around the world, the King James Bible. And yet, the Bible is not the oldest legal text we have, nor is James's essay the oldest reference to the concept of justice in relation to king and God. The second oldest written law code ever discovered is that of King Hammurabi of Babylon, in the ancient land of what today is known as Iraq. Iraq was home to a number of remarkable innovations. Yes, agriculture and currency and axles for chariots. But a written law? That's truly amazing. Before anyone writes down a law, the spoken law, is whatever the king says it is. And you've got to appreciate how dangerous that is. Today, the king says that all men in his kingdom must wear blue. Tomorrow, he changes his mind and says that if you're caught wearing blue, you'll be executed. Who's to stop him? The law is whatever he says it is. But when the law is written down, suddenly it takes on a life of its own. The king dies, but the law is still there. A written law, you could argue, is the first true recognition of human rights. So how did Hammurabi's law come about? Hammurabi says in the law code itself that he was commanded by God to give this body of 282 laws for the good of the people. God, in this case, being Anna and Bel, ancient gods of Mesopotamia. With these laws, Hammurabi no doubt hoped to stabilize his vast kingdom, to bring not just peace and prosperity to his people, but to ensure their loyalty, their obedience as well. Nonetheless, the recognition of justice in this text is an innovation in human society, justice for all people. Hammurabi's law states that he was ordered to bring about the rule of righteousness in the land, to destroy the wicked and the evildoers, so that the strong should not harm the weak. For the first time in human history, those who governed the people were being commanded by their God to show special mercy to those in lesser circumstances. That's a really significant step towards civilized societies. Which is not to say that this law recognized the equality of all people, far from it. It distinguished between nobles, commoners, and slaves, for example. Yet no one was above the law. Even the king, at least in theory, was bound by the same law he had transmitted to his people from the gods. Moreover, the law of Hammurabi continued to recognize men as superior to women. Babylonian society was strongly patriarchal, recognizing the uncontested rights of men over their wives, children, and property, to dispose of any of these as they saw fit. As these laws indicate, women were in some senses protected from men. For instance, a woman had the legal right to seek separation and restitution from an abusive husband. However, she could only win her case if she could prove her husband's abusiveness or neglect, as well as her own flawlessness or perfection. She had to prove herself to be perfect before the law would acknowledge his imperfections. Conversely, if she failed to do so, and the man could show that she did indeed have significant flaws, he retained the right, by law, to have her drowned. Hammurabi's law prescribed some rather severe penalties, as you can see. In fact, punishments were specified for various forms of theft, and the severity of the punishment depended on who was involved in the crime. An interesting instance of crime and punishment you might be familiar with was a law in this code which stated that if a man caused a gentleman to lose an eye, his punishers should cause him to lose an eye. In other words, this is the oldest known penalty of an eye for an eye in written law. As for the penalty for delivering false testimony, well, witnesses and written evidence had to be produced and a written verdict issued, right? So in the case of conflicting testimony, two witnesses insisting on opposite things, opposing parties, would sometimes submit an oath of truth to the gods. You know, presumably based on the idea that someone who swears to tell the truth before the gods would do so, a custom we've retained in our legal system. Well, in Hammurabi's code, if you've made such an oath and it's proven that you lied, the penalty is death.